The history of Catholic dogmatic theology divides into three main periods: the patristic, the medieval, the modern. Patristic period. The Fathers of the Church are honored by the Church as her principal theologians. Tertullian died a Montanist, and Origen showed a marked leaning towards Hellenism. Some of the Fathers, e.g. Saint Cyprian and Gregory of Nyssa, were unorthodox on individual points, the former in regard to the baptism of heretics, the latter in the matter of apocatastasis. It was not so much in the catechetical schools of Alexandria, Antioch, and Edessa as in the struggle with the great heresies of the age that patristic theology developed. This serves to explain the character of the patristic literature, which is apologetical and polemical, parenetical and ascetic, with a wealth of exegetical wisdom on every page, for the roots of theology are in the Bible, especially in the Gospels and in the epistles of St. Paul. It was not the intention of the Fathers to give a systematic treatment of theology. Moeller called attention to the variety found in the writings. The apologetic style is represented by the letter of Dionysius and the letters of St. Ignatius, the dogmatic in Pseudo-Barnabas, the moral in the Pastor of Hermes, canon law in the letter of Clement of Rome, church history in the Acts of the Martyrdom of Polycarp and Ignatius. After the recovery of lost manuscripts may be added, the liturgical style in the Didache, the catechetical in the proof of the apostolic preaching by Irenaeus. Although the different epochs of the patristic age overlap each other, it may be said in general that the apologetic style predominated in the first epoch up to Constantine the Great, while in the second epoch, that is to say up to the time of Charlemagne, Christian writers against paganism and Judaism had to explain the truths of natural religion, such as God, the soul, creation, immortality, and freedom of the will. At the same time, they had to defend the chief mysteries of the Christian faith, as the Trinity, incarnation, etc., and had to prove the sublimity, beauty, and conformity to reason. The list of those against pagan polytheism is long. Justin, Athenagoras, Tatian, Theophilus of Antioch, Hermias, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Cyprian, Minucius Felix, Commodianus, Arnobius, Lactantius Prudentius, Firmicius Maternus, Eusebius of Caesarea, Athanasius, Gregory of Nazianzus, Cyril of Alexandria, Nilus, Theodore, Orosius, and Augustine of Hippo. The most prominent writers against Judaism were Justin, Tertullian, Hippolytus of Rome, Cyprian, Athanasius, Gregory of Nyssa, Epiphanius of Salamis, Chrysostom, Cyril of Alexandria, Isidore of Seville, with attacks on Jews who refused to recognize the prophetic Christian interpretation of the Old Testament. The efforts of the Fathers to define and combat heresy brought writings against Gnosticism, Manichaeism, and Priscillianism, with the focus on principles of faith and the Church's authority. In the struggles against Monarchianism, Sabellianism, and Arianism, the emphasis was on the true meaning of the dogma of the Trinity. When the contest with eunomianism broke out, theological and philosophical criticism turned to the doctrine of God and our knowledge of Him. The Christological disputes began with the rise of Apollinarianism, reached their climax in Nestorianism, monophysitism, and monothelitism, and were revived once more in adoptionism. In this long and bitter strife, the doctrine of Christ's person, of the Incarnation and redemption, and in connection with that Mariology also, was placed on an orthodox foundation. Eastern Christian in this dispute on the Trinity and Christology included the Alexandrines, Clement, Origen, and Didymus the Blind, Athanasius and the three Cappadocians, Basil, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa, Cyril of Alexandria and Leontius of Byzantium, finally, Maximus the Confessor and John Damascene. In the West the leaders were Tertullian, Cyprian, Hilary of Poitiers, Ambrose, Augustine, Jerome, Fulgentius of Ruspa, Pope Leo I and Pope Gregory I. As the contest with Pelagianism and semi-Pelagianism clarified the dogmas of grace and liberty, providence and predestination, original sin and the condition of our first parents in paradise, so also the contests with the Donatists brought codification to the doctrine of the sacraments, the hierarchical constitution of the Church, her magisterium, a teaching authority, and her infallibility. Augustine here was the leader, and next to him came Optatus of Mileve and disciples. A culminating contest was decided by the Second Council of Nicaea. It was in this struggle that, under the leadership of John Damascene, the communion of saints, the invocation of the saints, the veneration of relics and holy images were placed on a basis of orthodoxy. These developments left the dogmatic teachings of the Fathers as a collection of monographs rather than a systematic exposition. Irenaeus shows attempts at synthesis. The trilogy of Clement of Alexandria marks an advance in the same direction, but the most successful effort in Christian antiquity to systematize the principal dogmas of faith was made by Origen in his work De Principis, which is unorthodox. Gregory of Nyssa then endeavored in his large catechetical treatise to correlate in a broad synthetic view the fundamental dogmas of the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the Sacraments. In the same manner, though somewhat fragmentarily, Hilary developed in his work De Trinitate the principal truths of Christianity. The catechetical instructions of Cyril of Jerusalem, especially his 5 mystagogical treatises on the Apostles' Creed and the 3 sacraments of baptism, confirmation, and the Holy Eucharist, contain an almost complete dogmatic treatise. Epiphanius, in his 2 works Incuratus and Pandarium, aimed at a complete dogmatic treatise, and Ambrose in his chief works, De Fide, De Spirituis, De Incarnatione, De Mysteriis, De Poenitentia, treated the main points of dogma in classic Latinity, though without any attempt at a unifying synthesis. In regard to the Trinity and Christology, Cyril of Alexandria was a model for later dogmatic theologians. Augustine of Hippo wrote 1 or 2 works, as the De Fide Symbolo and the Enchiridium, which are compendia of dogmatic and moral theology, as well as his speculative work De Trinitate. His disciple Fulgentius of Ruspa wrote an extensive and thorough confession of faith under the title De Fide ad Petrum, seu regula recti fide. Towards the end of the patristic age, Isidore of Seville in the West and John Damascene in the East paved the way for a systematic treatment of dogmatic theology. Following closely the teachings of Augustine and Gregory the Great, Isidore proposed to collect all the writings of the earlier fathers and to hand them down as a precious inheritance to posterity. The results of this undertaking were the Libri 3 Sententiarum seu de Sumo Bono. Tages of Saragossa had the same end in view in his Libri V Sententiarum. The work of John Damascene not only gathered the teachings and views of the Greek fathers, but reduced them to a systematic whole. He deserves to be called the first and the only scholastic among the Greeks. His main work, which is divided into 3 parts, is entitled Fonsantiae, because it was intended to be the source not merely of theology, but of philosophy and church history as well. The third theological part, known as Expositio Fide Orthodoxae, is a combination of positive and scholastic theology, and aims at thoroughness. After John Damascene, Greek theology went through the Phocian Schism. The only Greek prior to him who had produced a complete system of theology was Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. In the 5th century, but he was more popular in the West, at least from the 8th century on, than in the East, although he openly wove into the Catholic system Neoplatonic thoughts and phrases. Nevertheless, he enjoyed an unparalleled reputation among the scholastics of the Middle Ages. For all that, scholasticism did not take its guidance from John Damascene or Pseudo-Dionysius but from Augustine. Augustinian thought runs through the whole progressive Western Catholic philosophy and theology. The Venerable Bead, a contemporary of John Damascene, had solid education in theology, and extensive knowledge of the Bible and of the Fathers of the Church. He is the link which joins the patristic with the medieval history of theology. Middle Ages. The beginnings of scholasticism may be traced back to the days of Charlemagne. Thence it progressed in ever-quickening development to the time of Anselm of Canterbury, Bernard of Clairvaux, and Peter the Lombard, and onward to its full growth in the Middle Ages. The most brilliant period of scholasticism embraces about 100 years, and with it are connected the names of Alexander of Hales, Albertus Magnus, Bonaventure, Thomas Aquinas, and Duns Scotus. For the beginning of the 14th century, owing to the predominance of nominalism and to the sad condition of the Church, scholasticism began to decline. First Epoch, beginning and progress of scholasticism. In the first half of this epoch, up to the time of Anselm of Canterbury, the theologians were more concerned with preserving than with developing the writings of the Fathers. Theology was cultivated nowhere with greater industry than in the cathedral and monastic schools, founded and fostered by Charlemagne. The earliest signs of a new thought appeared in the 9th century during the discussions relative to the Last Supper. These speculations were carried to a greater depth in the Second Eucharistic controversy against Berengarius of Tours. The only systematic theologian of this time, Scotus Erigena, was an avowed pantheist. Anselm of Canterbury was the first to bring a sharp logic to bear upon the principal dogmas of Christianity, and to draw up a plan for dogmatic theology. Taking the substance of his doctrine from Augustine, Anselm, as a philosopher, was not so much a disciple of Aristotle as of Plato, in whose dialogues he had been schooled. Another pillar of the Church was Bernard of Clairvaux, the father of mysticism, though for the most part the author of ascetic works with a mystical tendency. He used the weapons of scientific theology against Abelard's rationalism and the realism of Gilbert de la Porree. It is upon the doctrine of Anselm and Bernard that the scholastics of succeeding generations took their stand, and it was the spirit which lived in the theological efforts of the University of Paris. Less prominent, yet noteworthy, are Ruprecht of Dordtz, William of Dieri, Gaufridus, and others. The first attempts at a theological system may be seen in the so-called books of sentences, collections and interpretations of quotations from the Fathers, more especially of Augustine. One of the earliest of these books is the Summa Sententiarum, an anonymous compilation created at the School of Lonesome Time after 1125. Another is the Sacraments of the Christian Faith, written by Hugh of St. Victor around 1135. His works are characterized throughout by a close adherence to Augustine and, according to the verdict of Scheban, may serve as guides for beginners in the theology of Augustine. The similar work of Robert Pullen is careless in arranging the matter and confuses the various questions of which he treats. Peter the Lombard, called the Magister Sententiarum, on the other hand, stands above them all. What Gratian had done for canon law, the Lombard did for dogmatic and moral theology. He sifted and explained and paraphrased the patristic law in his Libri Ivi Sententiarum, and the arrangement which he adopted was was, in spite of the lacunae, so excellent that up to the 16th century his work was the standard textbook of theology. The work of interpreting this text began in the 13th century, and there was no theologian of note in the Middle Ages who did not write a commentary on the sentences of the Lombard. Hundreds of these commentaries are still unprinted. No other work exerted such a powerful influence on the development of scholastic theology. Neither the analogous work of his disciple, Peter of Poitiers, nor the important Summa Aurea of William of Auxerre superseded the Lombard's sentences. Along with Alain of Lille, William of Auvergne, who died as Bishop of Paris, deserves special mention. Though preferring the free, unscholastic method of an earlier age, he yet shows himself at once an original philosopher and a profound theologian, inasmuch as in his numerous monographs on the Trinity, the Incarnation, the Sacraments, etc., he took into account the anti-Christian attacks of the Arabic writers on Aristotelianism. He is a connecting link between this age and the 13th century. Second Epoch, Scholasticism at its zenith. This period of scholasticism was marked by the appearance of the theological summae, as well as the mendicant orders. In the 13th century the champions of scholasticism were to be found in the Franciscans and Dominicans, beside whom worked also the Augustinians, Carmelites, and Servites. Alexander of Hales was a Franciscan, while Albert the Great was a Dominican. The Summa Theologiae of Alexander of Hales is the largest and most comprehensive work of its kind, flavored with Platonism. Albert was an intellectual working not only in matters philosophical and theological but in the natural sciences as well. He made the first attempt to present the entire philosophy of Aristotle and to place it at the service of Catholic theology. The logic of Aristotle had been rendered into Latin by Boethius and had been used in the schools since the end of the 6th century, but his physics and metaphysics were made known to Western Christendom only through the Arabic philosophers of the 13th century. His works were prohibited by the Synod of Paris in 1210, and again by a bull of Pope Gregory IX in 1231. But after the scholastics, led by Albert the Great, had gone over the faulty Latin translation once more, and had reconstructed the doctrine of Aristotle and its principles, Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas marked the highest development of scholastic theology. St. Bonaventure follows Alexander of Hales, his fellow religious and predecessor, but surpasses him in mysticism and clearness of diction. Unlike the other scholastics of this period, he did not write a theological summa, but a commentary on the sentences, as well as his Breviarium, a condensed summa. Alexander of Hales and Bonaventure represent the old Franciscan schools, from which the later school of Duns Scotus essentially differed. Thomas Aquinas holds the same rank among the theologians as does Augustine among the fathers of the Church. He is distinguished by a wealth of ideas, systematic exposition of them, and versatility. For dogmatic theology his most important work is the Summa Theologica. Pope Leo XIII in his encyclical Aeterni Patris restored the study of the scholastics, especially of St. Thomas, in all higher Catholic schools, a measure which was again emphasized by Pope Pius X. Richard of Middleton is a classical representative of the Franciscan school. Among the Servites, Henry of Ghent, a disciple of Albert the Great, deserves mention. His style is original and rhetorical. His judgments are independent. His treatment of the doctrine on God attests the profound thinker. Thomas's pupil Peter of Tarentaise became Pope Innocent V. Ulrich of Strasbourg is little known, though his unprinted Summa was held in high esteem in the Middle Ages. Egidius of Rome differed in detail from the teaching of Aquinas, but the attempt of the Augustinian Gavardis in the 17th century to create a distinctly Egidian school proved a failure. On the other hand, adversaries of Aquinas sprang up even in his lifetime. The first attack came from England and was led by William de la Mare of Oxford. Duns Scotus, by bold and virulent criticism of the Thomistic system, was to a great extent responsible for its decline. Scotus is the founder of a new Scholastic school in the speculative treatment of dogma, where Aquinas likens the system of theology and philosophy to the animal organism, which the soul unifies. In Scotus's own words, on the other hand, the order of things is rather symbolized by the plant, the root shooting forth branches and twigs which have an innate tendency to grow away from the stem. Scotism won a victory over Thomism by its doctrine concerning the Immaculate Conception. Later Franciscans, among them Constantine Saninus and John of Rada, set about minimizing or even reconciling the doctrinal differences of the two. Third epoch, gradual decline of scholasticism. The following period showed both consolidation and disruption. The Fraticelli, nominalism, conflict between church and state. The spread of nominalism owed much to two pupils of Duns Scotus, the Frenchman Peter Aureolus and the Englishman William Mockham. Marsilius of Padua and John of Jandun opposed the primacy of the Pope. The principal Concilium Supra Papam was important to the times of the Council of Constance and Council of Basel. Pierre Daly and Jean Gerson embraced doctrines which they abandoned after the Western Schism was healed. Prominent later nominalists were the general of the Augustinians, Gregory of Rimini, and Gabriel Bead, who has been called the last scholastic. Nominalist subtleties, coupled with an austere Augustinism, made Gregory of Rimini the precursor of Beanism and Jansenism. Gabriel Bead praised Occam and commented on his writings. Nominalism had less effect on the Dominican theologians, with the possible exceptions of Durand of St. Pourçain and Holcode. Its members were as a rule loyal Thomists. Most prominent among them during the first half of the 14th century were Herveus de Nedelec, an opponent of Scotus, John of Paris, Peter of Palude, and especially Ranierius of Pisa, who wrote an alphabetical summary of the doctrine of Aquinas. A prominent figure in the 15th century is Antonine of Florence, a compiler and versatile author of a Summa Theologiae. A powerful champion of Thomism was John Capriolus, the Prince of Thomists. In his Adamantine, Clypius Thomistarum, he repelled the adversaries of Thomism with the very words of Thomas. It was only in the early part of the 16th century that commentaries on the Summa Theologica of Aquinas began to appear. Among the first to undertake this work being Cardinal Cajetan of Vio and Conrad Collin. The philosophical Summa contra Gentiles found a masterly commentator in Francis of Ferrara. The Franciscans partly favored nominalism, partly adhered to pure Scotism. Among the latter group were Francis Maironus, John of Colonia, Peter of Aquila, who as abbreviator of Scotus was called Scotulus, Nicolaus de Orbelus, and Franciscus Ligatus, a famous commentator of Scotus. William of Vorey-Long, Stephen Bruleffer, and Nicholas of Nice belonged to a third class which is characterized by the tendency to closer contact with Bonaventure. Splits are discernible in the schools of the other orders. While the Augustinians James of Viterbo and Thomas of Strasbourg attached themselves to Egidius of Rome, Gregory of Rimini, mentioned above, championed an undisguised nominalism. Alphonsus Vargas of Toledo, on the other hand, was an advocate of Thomism in its strictest form. Among the Carmelites, also, divergencies of doctrine appeared. Gerard of Bologna was a staunch Thomist Calvinist, while John Baconthorpe delighted in trifling controversies against the Thomists, and endeavored to found a new school in his order. Generally speaking, however, the later Carmelites were followers of Aquinas. The order of the Carthusians produced in the 15th century a prominent and many-sided theologian in the person of Dionysius Reichel, surnamed the Carthusian, a descendant of the Levis family, who set up his chair in Roermond. From his pen we possess commentaries on the Bible, Pseudo-Dionysius, Peter the Lombard, and Aquinas. He was equally conversant with mysticism and scholasticism. Albert the Great, Henry of Ghent, and Dionysius, a representative of German theology of the Middle Ages. The anonymous German theology, edited by Martin Luther, is distinct from the German theology of Bishop Berthold of Chiemsee. Outside the religious orders were many other. The Englishman Thomas Bradwardine was the foremost mathematician of his day and Archbishop of Canterbury. His sombre work De Causa Dei contra Pelagianes was later used by Calvinist Anglicans. Richard Radulphus, Bishop of Armagh, in his controversy with the Armenians, paved the way for Wycliffe. Surnamed Waldenses, stands out as a controversialist against the Whitlerites and Hussites. Nicholas of Cusa inaugurated of a new and unorthodox speculative system in dogmatic theology. A thorough treatise on the Church was written by John Torquemada, and a similar work by St. John Capistran. Alphonsus de Statis was a scholar, the equal of Nicholas of Lyra in scriptural learning. He interspersed his biblical commentaries on the scriptures with dogmatic treatises. His work, Quinque Paradoxa, is a treatise on Christology and Mariology.